You feel the cold marble beneath your knees. The silk blindfold is removed, and your eyes struggle to adjust to the candlelight dancing across golden walls. Around you, 12 other boys kneel in perfect silence, some trembling, others frozen like statues. An official circles behind you, his footsteps deliberate, measuring. He stops. His hand touches your shoulder. You don't know it yet, but in this single moment, your childhood has just ended, and something unspeakable has begun. Before we step deeper into this palace of secrets, I'd love to know, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It never ceases to amaze me how a story buried in Ottoman archives for centuries can now reach someone halfway across the globe, in your living room, right now. This is Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, heart of the Ottoman Empire, in the year 1543. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the man European courts called the most powerful ruler on earth, presides over an empire stretching from Budapest to Baghdad, from the gates of Vienna to the shores of Yemen. But behind the diplomatic letters and military triumphs, behind the architectural marvels and the legal reforms that would reshape Islamic jurisprudence, there existed a parallel empire, one built not on conquest or commerce, but on the systematic acquisition, transformation, and exploitation of boys. The official archives held in the Topkapi Palace Museum today contain something historians long avoided discussing: detailed ledgers documenting the procurement, training, and deployment of young males within the imperial household. These weren't soldiers. They weren't scribes. The Ottoman Turkish had a specific term for them, icholan, meaning inner boys, and the records of what happened to them reveal a system so calculated, so deeply embedded in the machinery of power, that it operated with bureaucratic precision for over 4 centuries. How does an empire convince itself that this is normal? That question would haunt the few who dared document what they witnessed. The system began far from the palace, in villages scattered across the Balkans, Christian communities in Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and Greece. Every 3 to 5 years, Ottoman officials arrived with census documents, military escorts, and a quota to fill. They called it the devshirme, which translates delicately as collection or gathering. But the mothers who watched their sons taken at dawn had more visceral words for it. The selection process was methodical. Boys between 8 and 18 were examined not just for health or intelligence, but for beauty. An eyewitness account from a Venetian diplomat in 1523 describes the scene with disturbing clinical detail. Officials checking bone structure, skin clarity, the shape of lips and eyes, the timbre of voice. They were looking for aesthetic potential the way art collectors evaluate unfinished marble. The most striking boys were marked for palace service. The rest might become Janissaries' elite soldiers with their own brutal training regimen. But for those selected for the inner palace, for the Sultan's private quarters, the path ahead was something else entirely. They were marched to Istanbul in groups, given Turkish names to replace their Christian ones, and formally converted to Islam in ceremonies designed to sever every psychological tie to their previous lives. Surviving letters from parents kept in monastic archives in Serbia and preserved by Greek Orthodox communities speak of children who returned years later unable to recognize their own mothers, who flinched when addressed in their native tongues, who had been so thoroughly remade that their former identities existed only as ghosts. But here's where the documented history becomes almost unbearable. Inside the palace, these boys entered a hierarchy governed by proximity to power, and proximity meant intimacy. The harem-i-Humayun, the imperial harem, is famous for housing the Sultan's female concubines. What's less known is that a parallel institution existed for young males, the Kailer-e-Haz and the Seferli quarters, where the most beautiful boys lived under constant supervision, trained in arts that had nothing to do with administration or warfare. A 1573 report by Ottoman historian Seleniki Mustafa Efendi, long dismissed as exaggeration, describes evening gatherings in the Sultan's private chambers, where these boys performed dances dressed in elaborate costumes, their faces painted, their movements choreographed to seduce. He writes, with carefully neutral language, that the Sultan's affection for certain pages was of a nature that exceeded the bonds of mentorship. The Ottoman elite practiced a complex form of pederasty, rooted in a Persianate aesthetic tradition that romanticized the love between older men and beardless youths. Poetry from the era, works by court poets like Baki and Fuzuli, is saturated with imagery celebrating the beauty of young boys, their gazelle-like eyes, their rose-petal cheeks. These weren't metaphors, they were advertisements. Palace pages, known as gulam, literally servant boy, but carrying heavier connotations, were ranked by their beauty and trained in the art of pleasing. Ambassadorial reports from Austrian and Venetian envoys describe witnessing boys serving wine to the Sultan and his guests, sitting on laps, being caressed openly during state dinners. One Venetian account from 1585 notes with barely concealed shock, "The Turks take more delight in their boys than in their women, and this is visible even in public, without shame." But private was far worse than public. Archival documents uncovered by historian Leslie Pierce reveal something chilling: a ranking system. Boys were categorized by age, appearance, and specialization. Some were designated for general service. Others, marked in the ledgers with specific notations, were reserved for the Sultan's Özel Hizmet, his special service. The euphemism fools no one when cross-referenced with other palace documents describing bedroom protocols, nightly rotations, and punishment records for boys who failed to please. The most disturbing detail comes from medical treatises. Ottoman palace physicians wrote extensively about maintaining the health and appearance of young males in service. A 1612 medical manuscript held in the Suleimani Library discusses treatments for injuries consistent with sexual trauma, remedies for melancholy of the soul, afflicting palace boys, and procedures for preserving youthful appearance beyond natural years. Reading between the clinical language, the reality emerges. These children were being systematically used, and the empire had developed medical infrastructure to keep them functional. Then there's the matter of castration. Not all male concubines were eunuchs, but the empire maintained a population of castrated boys and men within the palace complex. The procedure was never performed in Istanbul itself, officially banned to maintain a veneer of Islamic propriety, but boys were castrated in Egypt or the Caucasus before being transported to the palace. Survival rates were catastrophic. A 16th-century document estimates that for every 10 boys castrated, 3 survived the immediate aftermath, and only 1 remained healthy enough for palace service. Why would an empire sustain this level of loss? Because eunuchs represented ultimate control. Unable to father children, stripped of sexual agency, physically marked as permanent outsiders, they could rise to enormous administrative power while remaining psychologically tethered to the system that had unmade them. The most powerful eunuch, the Kızlar Ağası, chief of the girls, controlled access to the Sultan and amassed fortunes that rivaled provincial governors. But the price of that power was visible in their bodies, written in surgical scars and pharmaceutical dependencies. Here's what makes this harder to process. Many of the boys accepted their fate. Not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was worse. Resistance meant death or expulsion, not back to family, but into a world where they no longer belonged. Boys who had been raised Christian but converted to Islam, who spoke Turkish better than their native tongues, who had been trained in palace etiquette but knew nothing of village life, had nowhere to return to. The system didn't need chains when it could make captivity the only viable reality. Some boys, incredibly, thrived. The Ottoman system allowed for spectacular social mobility precisely because it severed traditional family ties. A Christian shepherd's son, if beautiful and clever enough, could become the Sultan's favorite, accumulate wealth, and wield influence over military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations. The Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, one of the empire's most brilliant administrators, had been taken as a boy from a Serbian village through the devshirme system. His story is often told as proof of Ottoman meritocracy. What's left out is what he likely endured to reach that position. The palace maintained elaborate rituals around the boys. Every evening, a ceremony called the Kılıç Alaya involved pages presenting themselves in the throne room, ranked by beauty and skill. The Sultan would select companions for the night, sometimes for conversation or entertainment, sometimes for more. Boys learned to read the subtlest signals, which gesture meant dismissal, which glance meant selection, which silence meant danger. And there was constant danger. Palace politics were a blood sport. Boys who gained too much influence over the Sultan became targets for rival factions. Poisoning was common. So were accidents, falls from windows, drownings in baths, sudden illnesses that physicians couldn't quite explain. The turnover rate was staggering. A 1592 inventory lists 400 boys in palace service. A decade later, fewer than 30 from that original cohort remain in the records. The rest vanish reassigned, discarded, or dead. European observers documented this with a mixture of fascination and horror. The Flemish diplomat Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, ambassador to Sultan Suleiman's court in 1555, wrote extensive letters describing the unnatural affections of the Ottomans, noting that courtiers compete for the favor of beautiful boys. As in other lands, they compete for beautiful women. His letters circulated in European courts, feeding both Orientalist fantasies and genuine moral outrage. But outrage didn't stop European powers from engaging in diplomatic gift exchanges that sometimes included, disturbingly, the presentation of attractive young pages as gestures of goodwill. The practice wasn't unique to the Ottomans. Pederasty existed in various forms across the medieval Islamic world. In Safavid Persia, Mughal India, and the courts of Central Asian Khanates. But the Ottomans systematized it with imperial efficiency, creating institutional structures that endured longer and touched more lives than anywhere else. By the 18th century, Western influence and internal reform movements began challenging these practices. Intellectuals like Ibrahim Mutafarrika questioned the devshirme system on both moral and practical grounds. Sultans like Mahmud II, modernizing the empire along European lines, quietly phased out the most visible aspects of male concubinage. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century formally abolished the devshirme and imposed new standards on palace conduct. But the scars remained. Villages in the Balkans passed down stories of the taking for generations, tales of sons who never returned or who came back as strangers wearing Ottoman silks, unable to meet their father's eyes. Greek folk songs from the period lament the paidomazoma, the child gathering in lyrics so haunting they're still performed today. Serbian epic poetry preserves the names of boys taken to Istanbul, transforming historical trauma into cultural memory. What became of the boys themselves, the ones who survived, who grew into men marked by palace service? Some assimilated fully, becoming Ottoman officials who participated in the very system that had consumed their childhoods. Others lived in what we might now recognize as dissociative states, performing identities while remaining emotionally absent from their own lives. A few left memoirs, rare, fragmentary texts that speak in careful metaphors about service to the Sultan, while hinting at experiences that the authors themselves seemed unable to fully articulate. One such fragment, preserved in the Austrian state archives, comes from a former page named Gazanfer Agha, who eventually became a powerful eunuch administrator. He writes, "I learned early that survival required becoming what others needed me to be. After years of this, I no longer knew what I would have been if given the choice. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps I would have been nothing." The Topkapi Palace today is a museum. Tourists walk through the harem, marveling at tile work and fountains, photographing the Sultan's throne room and the jeweled treasures in the imperial treasury. But the quarters where the Ottoman lived remain largely unmarked, their purpose unexplained in exhibit placards. The stories stayed in archives, in Ottoman Turkish documents that few could read and fewer wanted to translate. Until recently. The past 2 decades have seen Turkish and international historians confronting this legacy with new honesty. Books like Leslie Pierce's The Imperial Harem and Tule Artan's research on palace culture have mapped the full scope of the system. What emerges is a portrait of an empire that, for all its grandeur, was built in part on the methodical breaking and remaking of children. The Ottoman Empire didn't invent sexual exploitation. Every major civilization has its catalogue of horrors. But what makes the Ottoman case particularly unsettling is the scale, the duration, and the bureaucratic thoroughness. This wasn't the impulsive cruelty of individual tyrants. It was policy, refined across centuries, normalized through religious interpretation and cultural practice, until the exploitation of boys became as unremarkable to the system as tax collection or military conscription. And perhaps that's the real nightmare hidden in the palace, not that monsters did monstrous things, but that an entire society organized itself to make monstrosity routine. The last recorded case of a boy being formally taken through the Devshirme system occurred in 1703. The abolition of the practice wasn't accompanied by apologies or reparations. It simply ended, fading from official policy while echoing in cultural memory. The boys became a footnote, their suffering absorbed into the vast, impersonal narrative of imperial history. But if you stand quietly in the empty courtyards of Topkapi today, in the early morning before the tourists arrive, you might hear what the historians heard when they first opened those ledgers. The whisper of names, hundreds upon hundreds of names, recorded in careful script next to ages and physical descriptions and assignments. Boys who knelt on cold marble. Boys who learned to survive by becoming what they were told to be. Boys who, centuries later, still wait in the archives to be acknowledged not as footnotes to empire, but as human beings who endured what no child should have to endure. They were there. The records prove it. And now, finally, we're willing to look.